The string quartet in the corner of the Grand Cathedral was playing Vivaldi, the champagne being poured by the waitstaff was a vintage Laurent Perrier, and the bride standing at the altar looked absolutely flawless in a custom-tailored Vera Wang gown. I was sitting in the second row, wearing a very tasteful, understated navy silk dress, holding a crystal flute of champagne that I hadn't taken a single sip from. The officiant, a man with a booming, theatrical voice that echoed off the vaulted stone ceilings, had just reached the part of the ceremony where he asked if anyone present objected to this union. The silence in the massive room was absolute, heavy, and thick with anticipation. Savannah, the woman in the white dress who had been my absolute best friend for 15 years, turned her head slightly over her lace-covered shoulder. She looked right past her bridesmaids and locked eyes with me, her gaze flashing with a smug, victorious, almost pitying spark. She had the man, she had the massive diamond ring, and she had the future she had always believed she was entitled to. I didn't stand up, I didn't scream obscenities, and I didn't throw my expensive drink or make a scene. I just smiled, a soft, genuine, terrifyingly calm smile, and I raised my glass to her in a silent, solitary toast. Savannah turned back to the altar, her shoulders visibly relaxing, entirely convinced that I was just a broken, defeated, humiliated woman forcing a brave face for polite society. She had absolutely no idea that while she was busy stealing my fiancé, I had spent the last 8 months methodically, surgically dismantling her entire existence. She didn't know that exactly 4 minutes from now, federal marshals were going to walk through those heavy oak doors at the back of the church. And she certainly didn't know that by signing that legally binding marriage license in the vestry 10 minutes ago, she hadn't just married the man of her dreams. She had legally assumed $3.4 million in fraudulent, inescapable debt. But to understand how we got to this beautiful, catastrophic wedding day, I need to take you back 14 months. You need to understand exactly who built this trap, and why I let them think they were winning for so long. My name is Clara Montgomery, I am 32 years old, and I am a senior supply chain auditor for a massive global logistics firm headquartered in Chicago. That is a very corporate, very boring way of saying that my entire professional existence is dedicated to finding things that are missing. I track complex discrepancies in massive, deliberately convoluted systems. I look at tens of thousands of lines of raw data, shipping manifests, and financial transfers, and I find the single, microscopic number that doesn't belong. I am not a loud person, I do not command attention when I walk into a room, and I prefer the quiet hum of a spreadsheet and the predictable safety of hard facts. Julian, on the other hand, was the sun. He was a charismatic, high-energy, devastatingly handsome commercial real estate developer. When he walked into a room, all the gravity immediately shifted toward him as he spoke in big ideas, multi-million-dollar projections, and sweeping gestures. We met at a charity gala for urban development, and for 3 years, I honestly thought I was the luckiest woman on the face of the earth. He made me feel seen, pulling me out of my quiet, structured shell. When we got engaged on a beautiful, moonlit balcony in Rome, I didn't just give him a yes, I handed him the keys to my entire life, my trust, and my future. And I mean literally handed him the keys. When my father passed away unexpectedly 5 years ago, it shattered my world. He was a quiet, hard-working man who saved every penny he earned, and when he died, he left me his only real asset. It was a fully paid-off, beautifully preserved historic brownstone in the Gold Coast neighborhood, valued at roughly $2.2 million. It was more than a house to me, it was my safety net, my sanctuary, and the physical manifestation of my father's lifelong labor to make sure I would always be safe. When Julian's development firm suddenly hit what he described as a temporary cash flow issue on a massive, high-stakes luxury condo project downtown, I didn't even hesitate. He was stressed, pacing our kitchen, talking about losing his investors, so I let him use my father's brownstone as collateral for a short-term bridge loan. We were getting married in less than a year, after all, and I believed in his vision. Savannah, my maid of honor, was intimately involved in all of this. We had known each other since we were awkward middle schoolers navigating braces and bad haircuts. She had grown up to be an interior designer, flashy, deeply ambitious, and chronically obsessed with high-end aesthetics, luxury brands, and the kind of wealth she felt she deserved but had never actually earned. She was constantly at our house, drinking my expensive wine, eating my food, helping Julian pick out imported Italian fixtures for his failing condo project. She endlessly complained about her own lack of funding to launch her boutique design firm. I trusted them both implicitly, thinking we were a team building a beautiful future together. The first crack in the glass of my perfect life happened on a Tuesday evening in late November. Julian was in New York, supposedly pitching a new round of angel investors to save his project. I was home alone, wearing sweatpants, working late from our shared home office. A massive winter storm had knocked out our primary router, and I needed to finish an audit report for work. I reached into Julian's desk drawer and grabbed his backup iPad, knowing he had the network admin application installed on it so I could reset the IP configuration. It was a simple, mundane task, but when I tapped the screen to wake it up, it didn't ask for a passcode. Julian had removed the security lock, probably out of sheer arrogance. Sitting right there in the center of the screen, a text message notification dropped down from the top banner. The sender name was simply Savannah. The message read, "Did the wire clear yet? The contractor is asking for the deposit on the Aspen house." I froze, my fingers hovering over the cold glass screen, trembling slightly. Aspen house? Julian didn't have a commercial project in Aspen, and he didn't even ski. My heart started to execute a slow, heavy, suffocating drumbeat against my ribs, and a cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. I tapped the notification banner, which didn't open standard text messages, but instead opened a hidden WhatsApp thread that he had buried in a secured folder. I sat in my quiet, empty house, the wind howling against the living room windows, the glow of the screen illuminating the absolute, catastrophic destruction of my entire life. I scrolled up and up and up, revealing 3 months of messages. There were 3 months of texts, intimate photos, audio notes, and meticulous financial planning. I read a message from Julian dated 2 weeks ago. "The wire hits the Shell account on Thursday. Clara is completely clueless. She didn't even read the updated loan covenant when she signed the last page." Savannah had replied, "God, I can't wait until we don't have to hide in these stupid hotels anymore. Are you sure her name is completely off the LLC liability?" Julian's response made my blood run instantly cold. "Done and done. The new loan is secured against her brownstone, but the cash is sitting in the Shell account under our names. We close on the Aspen property next month. I'll break the engagement with her by January. I'll just pull the old 'I need to find myself' routine. She won't fight it." Savannah's final message on that day was a picture of a diamond tennis bracelet, followed by, "I love you. You're brilliant. Let her keep her boring spreadsheets while we live the dream." I didn't cry, I didn't scream, and the shock was so profound, so absolute and violently thorough, that it bypassed standard human grief entirely and went straight to a cold, clinical, terrifying numbness. The man I loved and the woman I called my sister weren't just sleeping together. This was something far darker. I was an auditor who tracked fraud for a living, and my brain immediately switched out of the role of the heartbroken fiancé and locked seamlessly into forensic investigation mode. I bypassed the texts and went straight into Julian's email application, searching for the LLC names and loan documents he had referenced. It took me 45 minutes of digging through his deleted folders to piece together the architecture of their betrayal. He hadn't just taken a simple bridge loan to save his business. Julian and Savannah had forged my signature and faked a digital notary stamp to take out a massive, predatory, $3.4 million secondary commercial mortgage against my father's brownstone. They had taken the liquid cash from the bank, funneled it entirely through a brand new Shell LLC that they co-owned as equal partners. They were currently using that stolen capital to purchase a sprawling luxury property in Aspen, Colorado, legally titled under Savannah's name to hide the asset. Julian's master plan was terrifyingly simple. He was going to dump me right after the holidays, let his failing Chicago condo project officially default, declare corporate bankruptcy, and leave me holding the $3.4 million bag. Because my house was the collateral, the bank would foreclose on my inherited childhood home, seizing the property and leaving me utterly bankrupt, homeless, and financially destroyed for the rest of my life. Meanwhile, he and Savannah would be starting a beautiful, wealthy new life in the mountains with my stolen equity. I sat in the dark home office for 3 solid hours while the silence of the house pressed against my ears. At exactly midnight, my phone buzzed on the desk. It was Julian calling from his hotel room in New York. I stared at the caller ID for 10 seconds, taking a deep, slow breath, letting the icy reality of my situation harden my spine. I answered the phone, and his voice came through the speaker, dripping with that warm, fake, sickeningly sweet affection I had fallen in love with. "I miss you so much, baby," he purred, the sound of city traffic in the background. "This trip is exhausting. I just can't wait to come home to you." "I miss you too," I said, my voice smooth, steady, and terrifyingly normal. "Get some sleep, Julian. I love you." I hung up the phone. And then, I went to work. If you are listening to this right now and your heart is beating just a little bit faster, do me a favor. Take 1 second to hit that subscribe button, and let me know in the comments if you would have confronted them immediately, or if you would have kept your mouth shut like I did. I chose silence, because silence is a weapon if you know exactly how to wield it. The next morning, I did not call the police, I didn't scream at Julian, and I didn't send a furious, bridge-burning text message to Savannah. My auditor training had conditioned me to understand one fundamental truth: an accusation without airtight, legally binding leverage is just noise, and noise gives the guilty party time to hide their assets and manipulate the narrative. A forgery claim on a digital financial document is a messy, drawn-out civil nightmare that routinely takes 5 to 7 years to resolve in the court system. Julian would have hired a shark of a defense attorney and claimed I had verbally authorized the loan, and Savannah would have eagerly taken the stand to swear under oath that she personally saw me sign the documents. I needed something much heavier than a he-said-she-said lawsuit that would leave my home tied up in endless bank litigation. I needed federal gravity, and I needed absolute, inescapable destruction. So, I took a sick day from the logistics firm, dressed in my sharpest, most conservative navy suit, and drove through the freezing Chicago rain to the downtown office of Elias Thorne. Elias was a 72-year-old estate attorney who had managed my father's legal affairs for 3 decades. He was a man who wore heavy tweed suits, smelled faintly of cherry pipe tobacco, and possessed the legal and financial ruthlessness of a great white shark. I walked into his office, sat down in the leather chair opposite him, and without saying a single word, I laid the exported WhatsApp chats, the forged commercial loan documents, the digital notary logs, and the newly registered shell company filings directly onto his heavy mahogany desk. Elias read through every single page in complete, terrifying silence. The only sound in the room was the ticking of his antique grandfather clock and the rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. After 20 minutes, he slowly took off his reading glasses, polished them meticulously with a microfiber cloth, and looked at me with eyes that were cold, sharp, and entirely devoid of pity. "Clara," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, "this isn't just a case of infidelity or a bad breakup. This is felony wire fraud, federal bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft. If we go to the authorities right now, they will undoubtedly freeze the accounts and arrest Julian, but the lending institution will still tie up your father's brownstone in protective litigation for half a decade. You will spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees just trying to keep a roof over your head." I looked him dead in the eye, my spine rigid. "I don't want to go to the authorities right now, Elias," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet room like a scalpel. "I want to let them complete the theft, funnel the money into the Aspen property, and think they have completely won. And then, I want to legally sever myself from the liability and drop the federal anvil directly onto their heads." Elias stared at me for a long moment, and then a slow, dangerous, deeply impressed smile spread across his face. "You are definitely your father's daughter," he murmured. "Let's look at the commercial loan covenants." We spent the next 8 hours dissecting the massive, 50-page fraudulent mortgage document word by word, line by line. And right there, buried on page 34 in a dense block of legalese, Elias found the fatal flaw. Julian was arrogant, and arrogant men are fundamentally sloppy. In his desperate rush to secure the millions of dollars, He had structured the loan so that the physical debt was tied to my property as collateral. However, the primary liability, the actual legal obligation to pay the money back, could be formally assumed by the primary operator of the corporate shell LLC, which was Julian, if the original guarantor formally initiated a transfer and he accepted it in writing with a registered witness. Julian hadn't worried about that obscure clause because he never intended to accept the liability. He intended to take the cash, run to the mountains with my best friend, and leave me to default on the loan. "We need him to sign a liability transfer," Elias explained, tapping the document with his gold pen. "In wet ink, witnessed, and legally stamped, and we need to do it before he dumps you and executes his exit strategy." Over the next 2 months, I delivered an Oscar-worthy performance that tested the absolute limits of my human endurance. It was psychological torture of the highest order. I continued to cook Julian his favorite dinners, smiled when he kissed me, and let Savannah come over to my house to sit on my expensive couch and drink my vintage wine. I sat there, keeping my face perfectly composed, while she talked endlessly about how she was manifesting a big move to the mountains and how much she loved the winter aesthetic. I complimented her outfits and listened to them discuss our upcoming wedding with fake enthusiasm, knowing every word out of their mouths was a calculated lie designed to keep me docile. The cognitive dissonance was deafening. Every time I looked at Julian, I felt a wave of physical nausea. But every time I felt like screaming, throwing a glass at the wall, or demanding the truth, I just closed my eyes and pictured the sheer, unadulterated, life-ending terror that would eventually wash over their smug faces when the trap snapped shut. In late December, a week before Julian was scheduled to break off the engagement according to his hidden timeline, I made my move. I waited until he came home from the office, poured myself a glass of water to keep my hands from shaking, and sat him down at the kitchen table. I made sure I looked exhausted, highly stressed, and utterly panicked, holding a thick stack of complex legal papers that Elias had carefully, flawlessly drafted. "Julian," I said, rubbing my temples and letting my voice crack just a little bit, "my firm is doing a massive internal compliance and security audit. Because of my senior clearance level, the algorithms are digging deep into all of our personal assets. The commercial bridge loan on the brownstone is flagging as an extreme corporate liability because it's tied to an external commercial entity. Human Resources pulled me into a meeting today and told me it violates the company's anti-corruption policy. It's going to cost me my job, my pension, and my industry license if I don't clear the flag." Julian frowned, a flash of genuine panic widening his eyes. "What do you mean? What do they want you to do? Can they seize the funds?" he asked, his mind immediately leaping to the stolen millions. "No, no," I said quickly, sliding the stack of papers across the marble table toward him. "I talked to a corporate attorney. We can fix it temporarily without touching the cash. I just need to formally transfer the primary liability of the commercial loan to your LLC for 90 days, just until my audit clears the compliance review. It doesn't change the brownstone as the collateral, it just makes the debt look like a corporate obligation instead of a personal one on my credit report. We can switch it right back after the wedding. I just need you to sign this so I don't get fired on Friday." Julian read the summary page, but he did not read the fine print. Parasites rarely read the fine print when they think they are dealing with a subordinate. He saw an opportunity to play the hero, to keep me calm, unsuspecting, and financially stable until his Aspen deal officially closed. "Of course, baby," he said smoothly, pulling out his expensive Mont Blanc pen. "Whatever you need to keep your job safe. We are a team." He signed it. He signed his name on 3 separate lines, legally and permanently accepting full, unmitigated personal and corporate liability for the entire $3.4 million debt, severing it from my personal assets and my father's brownstone completely. A mobile notary, an associate of Elias whom I had waiting in her car down the street, knocked on the door 3 minutes later to officially witness and stamp the document. The moment Julian's pen lifted from that paper, my house was safe, and my future was secure. He was holding a ticking federal bomb in his hands, and he had absolutely no idea. 2 weeks later, right on his scheduled timeline, Julian broke up with me. He sat me down in our living room and cried fake, theatrical tears. He told me he was broken inside, that the stress of his business was eating him alive, that he couldn't give me the love and attention I deserved, and that he desperately needed to be alone to find himself. I acted appropriately devastated. I sobbed, I begged him to reconsider, and then I packed my bags, told him he had exactly 30 days to vacate my brownstone, and left to stay with a colleague. Less than a month later, Savannah's Instagram account went public with their relationship. The caption read, "Sometimes true love finds you when you least expect it, in the most surprising places," featuring a sickeningly posed photo of them kissing in the snow in front of the massive, multi-million-dollar Aspen property they had bought with my stolen equity. They moved incredibly fast. They were flush with stolen cash, drunk on their own perceived brilliance, and felt completely invincible. They announced a massive, lavish, high-society wedding for the following October. What they didn't know was that Elias and I hadn't stopped working for a single second. Once Julian legally assumed the liability, Elias took the entire dossier and formally filed the fraud evidence with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division and the lending bank's internal corporate fraud unit. The federal investigators were absolutely drooling over the file. Julian had moved fraudulent, stolen money across state lines to purchase luxury real estate using falsified collateral documents. It wasn't just a crime, it was a beautifully documented, easily prosecutable federal slam dunk. But during our meeting with the federal agents in a sterile conference room in the downtown field office, Elias asked the lead investigator for a highly specific, strategic delay. "If you arrest him right now," Elias argued, leaning across the table, "he will immediately declare corporate bankruptcy, and the bank will be forced to spend years fighting in civil court to claw back the Aspen property from the shell company. But if you wait until October 15th, he is getting married to his co-conspirator." Under the specific state laws governing this transaction, debt assumed prior to marriage can sometimes remain separate. But Julian and Savannah are co-owners of that shell LLC, so the absolute second they sign that legal marriage license and file it with the state, they legally merge their assets and their liabilities. Savannah becomes equally, personally responsible for the entire $3.4 million fraud. You don't just get him. You get her, and you can legally seize every single piece of her personal assets, her business accounts, and her future earnings to satisfy the restitution. The FBI agents looked at each other, smiled, and agreed. The government loves a highly efficient, multi-target asset forfeiture. Which brings us right back to the cathedral, the expensive string quartet, and the vintage champagne. Julian and Savannah had sent me a pity invitation, embossed on ridiculously expensive, heavy cardstock with gold foil lettering. They undoubtedly assumed I would be far too humiliated, broken, and financially terrified to actually show up to the event. They wanted the invitation to be a final slap in the face, a physical receipt of their victory over my quiet, boring life. So, I took the invitation, I booked a salon appointment, I bought a stunning, understated designer dress, and I showed up. I sat in the second row, perfectly composed, watching the officiant pronounce them husband and wife while the string quartet swelled. I listened to Savannah read her custom vows, her voice dripping with fake emotion as she promised to stand by Julian through wealth and through hardship, a line that actually made me bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing out loud given what was about to happen. The applause thundered through the vaulted stone ceilings as they kissed. Savannah looked like a queen holding court, turning to walk down the aisle, her eyes finding mine for that brief, smug second of absolute triumph. They turned the corner and disappeared into the private, wood-paneled vestry at the back of the cathedral to sign the state documents. This was the moment. In the state of Illinois, the ceremonial vows are just theater, the wet ink on the government paper is the legal binding. They were in that room with the officiant, signing the state-issued marriage certificate, formally merging their lives, their assets, and their hidden liabilities. I checked my gold wristwatch. 3 minutes passed. The string quartet shifted to a lively reception piece, and the 300 high society guests began to file out toward the grand ballroom for cocktails. And then, the heavy oak doors at the main entrance of the cathedral did not just open, they were pushed open with sudden, terrifying, authoritative force. It wasn't the caterers bringing in the hors d'oeuvres. It was 6 men and 2 women wearing dark, sharply tailored suits, accompanied by 3 uniformed city police officers acting as local jurisdiction escorts. The lead federal agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with iron-gray hair and an expression carved from absolute granite, bypassed the confused groomsmen and walked with terrifying purpose directly down the center aisle toward the vestry. I set my completely untouched champagne flute on a passing waiter's silver tray, smoothed the skirt of my dress, and followed them at a leisurely, measured pace. When I reached the open doorway of the vestry, the scene unfolding inside was an absolute masterpiece of forensic justice. Julian was backed against the historic wall, his face the exact color of wet cement, his mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish. Savannah was clutching the heavy layers of her Vera Wang gown, staring in absolute, uncomprehending horror at the federal marshal who was currently slapping a thick, heavily stamped stack of legal warrants down onto the antique table right next to their freshly signed marriage license. "Julian Mercer," the lead agent said, his voice echoing off the stone walls of the small room, slicing right through the distant sound of the party outside. "You are under federal arrest for felony wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft. Savannah Mercer, you are hereby served with an immediate, total asset freeze and federal forfeiture notice regarding the luxury property located in Aspen, Colorado, as well as all bank accounts, investment portfolios, and corporate holdings tied to Heartland LLC." Savannah let out a sound that I can only describe as a dying animal. "What?" she shrieked, her voice cracking into a hysterical, breathless pitch, looking frantically from the unsmiling agent to her pale new husband. "Julian, what is he talking about? Tell them it's a mistake. Tell them to get out of our wedding." "It's not a mistake, Savannah," I said, stepping smoothly into the doorway, perfectly framed by the chaos. They both snapped their heads toward me simultaneously. Julian's eyes went incredibly wide, the pupils dilating in sudden, crushing, apocalyptic realization. His arrogant brain finally connected the dots. He remembered the quiet kitchen table. He remembered the fake compliance audit. He remembered his expensive Mont Blanc pen signing those documents. "You," Julian whispered, his voice shaking so violently he could barely form the single syllable. "You set this up. You knew." "I am a senior supply chain auditor, Julian," I said smoothly, adjusting the strap of my leather purse. "I track missing assets and expose corporate fraud for a living. You arrogantly forged federal documents and you stole $3.4 million. I just made absolutely sure you signed the legal liability transfer in wet ink before you packed your bags and left me. Oh, and by the way, the bank's fraud unit formally released the commercial lien on my father's brownstone last Thursday. My property is completely clear. But since you two just signed that marriage license right there on the table, legally binding yourselves as a single financial entity." I gestured to the ink that was literally still drying on the legal document. "You are now both equally, personally liable for the millions you stole. The government isn't just taking the Aspen house, Savannah. They are taking your boutique design firm. They are taking your car. They are taking your personal savings. Congratulations on your union." Savannah lunged at him. She didn't scream at me, she turned violently on the man she had conspired with, beating her perfectly manicured fists against his tuxedo chest, screaming obscenities as her flawless bridal makeup ran down her face in thick, black, ugly rivers. The uniformed officers immediately stepped in, pulling her back forcefully as the lead agent grabbed Julian's wrists, spun him around, and clicked the heavy steel handcuffs shut. The sound of that metal locking into place was the single most beautiful piece of music I have ever heard in my entire life. I didn't stay to watch them march him out through the lobby in front of their hundreds of horrified guests. I didn't need to. I walked out of the side exit of the cathedral, stepped out into the crisp, beautiful autumn air, got into my waiting town car, and told the driver to take me home. The fallout over the next few months was spectacular and entirely public. Julian didn't even make it to bail. The judge deemed him a severe flight risk due to the hidden offshore elements of the shell company that Elias had uncovered. He pleaded guilty to avoid a 20-year sentence and is currently serving 7.5 years in a federal penitentiary in Indiana. Because of the absolute, immediate asset freeze, he couldn't afford the high-end defense attorney he thought he would have. Savannah desperately tried to file for an emergency annulment the very next morning, claiming total ignorance and fraud on his part, but the federal prosecutors laughed in her face. They had the WhatsApp chats I had exported, and they had her text messages confirming the wire transfers. She avoided actual jail time only by flipping on Julian and providing the government with the rest of his encrypted hard drives, but her financial ruin was absolute, permanent, and totally inescapable. The government seized the Aspen house, liquidated her business accounts, repossessed her luxury SUV, and drained every penny of her personal savings to pay back the remaining restitution to the bank. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that she is currently living in a cramped, unrenovated studio apartment above a noisy laundromat in a terrible neighborhood. She is working the front desk at a mid-tier commercial gym because no legitimate design firm will ever hire someone with a federal fraud conviction on their background check. Her credit is completely annihilated for the next decade. As for me? I sold my father's brownstone 3 months later for $2.4 million in cash to a lovely family who actually appreciates the historic architecture. I took an indefinite, fully funded sabbatical from the logistics firm. I am currently sitting on a private, sun-drenched stone balcony in Florence, Italy, overlooking the terracotta roofs of the city, drinking a glass of Chianti that costs more than Julian's current total net worth. My grandmother used to tell me that the loudest person in the room is usually the weakest, and the quietest person is usually the one holding the matches. Sometimes, the absolute best revenge isn't screaming, fighting, or destroying someone with your own hands. Sometimes, the most devastating revenge is simply stepping out of the way, handing them enough rope, and letting them absolutely destroy themselves with their own unchecked arrogance. Thank you so much for listening to my story until the very end. If you want more stories of brilliant payback, toxic people getting exactly what they deserve, and ultimate karma, there is another amazing story waiting on your screen right now. Click it, and I will see you there.